Here's a question. Why would a prosperous democracy look at a deeply integrated economic relationship with its nearest neighbors, one of the world's largest trading blocs, and choose to walk away? As this week marks the 10th anniversary of Britain's 2016 vote to leave the European Union, many are still asking that question. At the time, much of the world still lived under the post-Cold War order, globalized, open, and governed by shared rules. When Brexit's Leave campaign promised to take back control, for millions that slogan answered a growing unease about where that open world was headed. They wanted tighter borders and to reclaim an eroding sense of national sovereignty. In addition, Brexit's leading advocates saw another opportunity to remake Britain as Singapore-on-Thames. This was a vision of a buccaneering, deregulated, low-tax competitor right on Europe's doorstep, which would strike great trade deals with the wider world and in particular with the United States. But a decade on, that order has come apart. The U.S. elected Donald Trump just months after the referendum. Brexit supporters who cheered his victory as vindication found an uncertain world of trade barriers and a weaker transatlantic alliance. Even Singapore, Britain's supposed model, has warned that this new era would be very hostile for punchy economies built on openness to global trade. And in any case, Britain never built that nimble Singaporean-style economy. Boris Johnson governed as a big spender who briefly pushed the country to its highest tax burden since the end of World War II. As John Micklethwaite and Adrian Woolridge note in Bloomberg, Britain under Margaret Thatcher prospered by forging many of the rules of the free trade era. But now they write, as a more nationalistic world has fragmented into competing trading blocs, Britain has fallen through the cracks. Today, the economic data continues to show Brexit's persistent harm. Figures published by the National Bureau of Economic Research estimate that by 2025, Brexit had reduced Britain's GDP by between 6 and 8%, higher than earlier forecasts. The UK's own government watchdog says Brexit will lower UK trade by about 15%. But as The Economist argues, the real issue is that Brexit lingers like a toxin in the economy's bloodstream, binding itself to long-standing weaknesses, from higher energy costs to weak investment. Harder still to measure is the cost of everything else Britain did not do, while its politics were consumed by a revolving door of leaders at number 10 Downing Street, and an endless argument over how exactly to leave the EU, knowing every version of that answer would make it poorer. And after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the cost of being outside the EU became strategic as well as economic, as British defence firms have been largely shut out of the EU's new rearmament programme at a pivotal time. Britons themselves have soured on Brexit without yet agreeing on what comes next. New polling by Ipsos and King's College London finds that the share who say Brexit is going worse than they expected has nearly doubled in 5 years, from 28% in 2021 to 48% today. But while many feel regret, the man who did more than anyone to bring it about is closer to power than ever. Nigel Farage's Reform UK, a revived version of his Eurosceptic UK Independence Party, leads the national polls and swept last month's local elections, eroding the century-long dominance of Labour and the Conservatives. 10 years on, Brexit continues to define Britain's voting lines. Reform has absorbed much of the anti-EU coalition, older, more male, less likely to have a college degree, and driven above all by cultural anxiety over issues like immigration and race. The lesson of the past decade is that there are no clean exits and no clean returns either. As Martin Wolf of the FT argues, a reversal of Brexit would be unrealistic and, he argues, unnecessary. He advocates for a third way, modeled on Switzerland. It would not involve EU membership, but rather a patchwork of treaties to align closely with the bloc on trade, education, science, and security. This is far from perfect. Britain would become a rule taker in Europe rather than a rule maker. But with the promised rewards of going it alone still nowhere to be seen, it may be a move worth making. Thanks to all of you for being part of my program this week. I will see you next week.